I am not a psychologist. I am not a pediatrician. I am not a neurologist. I am not a medical researcher. And I am not a neuroscientist. I am a historian and not even a medical historian. And yet I'm going to take some risks today, and I'm going to talk about disabilities in children, because I am convinced that historians have something to offer that neuroscientists and biopsychologists do not. That is, we can offer a certain kind of perspective that I think can be very helpful at a time of intense parental anxiety and deep-rooted societal debates about how to deal with a variety of emergent disabilities. We'll see if I am right, and I welcome much discussion of the arguments that I'm going to make. Contemporary American childhood presents us with a paradox. On the one hand, by most measures, kids today are doing better than ever before, by almost every measure. Life expectancy, rates of infant mortality, school achievement, college test scores, smoking rates, even teenage pregnancy. By measure after measure, kids are doing fantastically, despite all the reasons we were led to believe kids should be doing awfully, right? The spread of single parenthood, the rise of two-worker households, massive immigration, all of those factors we were told repeatedly were going to have a huge liabilities for kids. But by almost every measure, despite persistent poverty in this country, kids are doing not just okay, but they're doing better than their parents and better than their grandparents. Not bad. And yet, if you read the newspapers, you read magazines, you watch television, or you talk to individual parents, that's not the sense you'd get at all, because anxiety is the hallmark of contemporary parenting. Parents worry from the moment, or even before the moment, that a woman gets pregnant. Right now, we're capable of diagnosing 900 prenatal conditions, of which we can deal with only a handful. And yet, that is only the beginning of the anxieties. Because once a child is born, all of our anxieties mount, beginning with sudden infant death syndrome and moving on and on. It is not that parents in the past did not worry, though some of their worries, like over posture, seem incredible to us, right? But you cannot be a parent today, I think, without being constantly worried about your children. And many of the things we worry about were not things that previous generations ever had any anxiety or concern over. And this strikes me as a historical question. Why is it that we worry about certain kinds of disabilities that no previous generation was aware of? Okay? And that's the kind of question that historians can deal with that perhaps pediatricians and neuroscientists cannot. Okay, that's the claim I want to make. Now, of course, there is a downside to progress. That means that we have more young people suffering from certain kinds of disabilities and chronic illnesses than ever before. After all, kids died earlier in the past, and kids with disabilities or chronic illnesses were particularly prone to die. But those aren't the issues that I'm going to be dealing with today. I'm going to be dealing with a series of what I'll call the new disabilities of childhood. And what I mean by that are childhood obesity, dyslexia, food allergies, autism, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Okay. Now, as a historian, when I talk about new, 100 years is new to me, right? It's not, doesn't have to be overnight. Now, with childhood obesity, it only was first identified as a problem in 1968 and didn't even receive a label for another decade. So it is genuinely new. Dyslexia is about a century old. But all of them are new, in my view, in the sense that it is only relatively recently that we as a society became concerned with these. And so the question that I ask as a historian is, what happened to make us conscious of disabilities that previous generations were blind to? One possibility, of course, is that there was a change in language or a change in definition, right? Maybe we called it mental retardation in the past, or we had a other word that we used to describe the same phenomena. After all, there's lots of books and magazine articles that will tell you that Mozart or Leonardo da Vinci was autistic, right? And maybe it's true, and maybe it isn't. They did not have the word, and maybe that's what's at stake in this. Another possibility is that certain kinds of incentives have emerged over time to identify certain disabilities that didn't exist in the past. That's another possibility. They could be commercial incentives. They could be legal incentives. That's another possibility. Or, conceivably, children are growing up in a more toxic environment. And there's something about our environment that is causing an increase in disabilities. That seems to me to be another possible explanation. But all of those are susceptible to historical analysis. And as a historian, I can therefore look at the construction of disabilities and the way they are culturally framed. Now let me stress, lest I be misunderstood, and it's really easy to misunderstand the point that I'm making, I am not saying that the disabilities are not real. I am not saying that treatments are arbitrary. All I'm saying is that for some reasons that need to be explicated, we see certain disabilities that previous generations were blind to. And that may be because we're smarter and have a more expansive moral consciousness than previous generations, though I tend to be doubtful about that, or at least skeptical about that. Or maybe, just maybe, those disabilities didn't exist in the past, or they weren't problematic in the past, for a variety of reasons that perhaps you and I can explicate. And I'm also, of course, deeply interested in what it means to children when we label a disability, right? It makes a huge difference if you're called husky, as kids were during the baby boom generation, and whether you're called obese, right? And I think, just speculating, I don't have evidence to suggest this, that it makes a big difference in kids' self-image, and not in a good way. And so I am interested in the construction and perception of childhood disabilities. I'm not trying to minimize the reality of disabilities or attempt to explain such phenomena away, which is always the claim made against any kind of social or constructionist approach to virtually any topic. But I do want to ask whether certain disabilities are timeless or understood differently at different points in time, or whether certain disabilities are more prevalent or more problematic than they were in the past. So the questions I'm going to ask are the following. Why is it that only at a certain point in time that a particular disorder or disability attracted public attention? Then, why does the incidence of certain childhood disabilities vary across time and place and social class? And then third, how and why has the definition, understanding, diagnosis, and treatment of these disabilities changed over time? And I would suggest to you that such questions are not simply of academic interest. They help us, I think, understand the culture-bound nature of the way we define problems and the culture-limited approach that we take to addressing disabilities. There's a wide variety of ways that disabilities could be understood and treated, and we use certain ways, and interestingly, other societies in the contemporary world take different approaches. And so it expands our options. To me, the great value of history is that it exoticizes the present. It makes our world look strange. It doesn't treat our world as inevitable, just as one configuration among many all around the world. So historians are like anthropologists, right? We see our world as a foreign world, and therefore illuminate the fact that there's other ways in which we can live, and maybe, in some cases, those other ways are better. They're certainly different. Now, lurking behind the analysis that I'm going to give you are certain long-term developments, because historians are really interested in long-term developments, and I'm one of those historians who's interested in history without people. That is, I'm very interested in these processes that occur whether people are conscious of them or unconscious of them. One of them that we've come up repeatedly during our conference is what I'll call the discovery of risk. The discovery of risk. When I was growing up, baby boomer that I am, if you broke your arm or you broke your leg, that was a source of pride, and you'd have everybody sign your cast. And today, when you see a kid with a broken arm or broken leg, you wonder, right? was some kind of physical violence inflicted on that kid? Or was the parent negligent with that kid? It's a very different attitude and not a very positive attitude, right? And we're paranoid about everything. We're paranoid about Halloween candy, as was mentioned, right? Or stranger abductions, or sexual molestation in daycare centers. It doesn't matter that it doesn't happen. We can be worried about it anyway, because paranoia means never having to have evidence, right? A second long-term process that lurks behind what I'm going to have to say is what we'll call the psychologizing of childhood. Now, that's obviously not brand new. Sigmund Freud exerted a powerful influence on our thinking that became increasingly evident in the 1920s and 1930s when we became convinced, rightly or wrongly, that the first 3 or 4 years of life dictate everything that follows. Just because it's not true doesn't mean that we don't believe it. This belief in the critical years, which has been challenged repeatedly by laboratory researchers, doesn't mean that it's declined any. In fact, I would argue it's more intense today than it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, or 80 years ago. But one particular facet of the psychologizing of childhood has grown particularly important, and that is the triumph of neurological, neurochemical, biophysiological, and genetic explanations for phenomena, as opposed to contextual, situational, and circumstantial explanations. So we're a little bit like the late 19th century, I would suggest, in which we're convinced that there is a neurological underpinning to almost every phenomena. Now, as a historian, I'm perfectly willing to believe that that's true, but I am also convinced that our knowledge of neuroscience is so primitive at this point that what we have instead is a kind of faux neuroscience in which we make vast generalizations based on surprisingly little evidence, and that therefore we should always be a bit cautious in this. Again, I'm not suggesting that this is wrong. I'm not simply dismissing this. I'm just saying we don't know very much at this point. Lots of research is necessary, and the research will certainly correct the way we're thinking right now. Another theme that will lurk behind what I have to say is what I'll call concept creep. Concept creep. That the way we use concepts is ever more elastic and expansive. We tend to take concepts and treat them allegorically or analogically, and we expand them to cover more and more and more. And if you ever want to see this in action, just look at the DSMs over time, where virtually every psychological disorder expands in scope. So what people didn't see in 1968, they suddenly see in 1978. If not then, they see it in 1998. And if not then, they see it in 2015. Interesting, right? And we tend to see things in general on a spectrum today, as opposed to discrete phenomena. And all of those, I would argue with you, are long-term historical processes that are taking place for good or ill, for right or wrong. They're just happening. I'm an observer, right? I'm the scorekeeper of history. And this is just what I see happening, and it's there for us to see. Then, and so to put it in more technical language, the diagnostic thresholds change, right? And they tend to become looser, more elastic, more expansive over time. And again, I'm not trying to say that this is wrong, just a phenomena we should be aware of. Now, I'm particularly interested in something that I'm going to call, because I lack a good phrase for it, a cultural system bank. A cultural system bank. In the late 19th century, many women were reported to suffer from a psychological ailment called hysteria, right? Which was diagnosed through certain symptoms. And today, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone suffering from that ailment. Does that mean hysteria didn't exist in the late 19th century? Of course it existed. People reported it. We have lots of evidence that existed. Does that mean that hysteria was cured? Of course not. We never developed a medication or a treatment that solved it. There was a set of symptoms that we saw at a particular moment in history, and eventually the system bank changed. I don't know why, but it did. And so one thing that I'd like to suggest to you that I'm going to hint at is that we too have system banks in our culture, and they take certain forms, but they are very much time-bound and they're culture-bound. And so they're not timeless. They're not going to exist forever. They're going to go away and be replaced by new symptoms. And what I will suggest to you is that what is at the root of many of those symptoms is, in a single non-clinical word, distress. And that people at various times suffer distress for various reasons, and there are culturally accepted outlets for that distress. And those change over time, as do the causes of the distress. But it's not like the distress is directly linked to the symptom, right? That is time-bound. That is a contingent connection, I would suggest. So the very factors that caused hysteria in the late 19th century, anxieties over pregnancy, anxieties over sexuality, the restrictions in women's roles, those still exist, right? But the symptoms in which they would be manifest would be very different than in the late 19th century. Just want to suggest that as lurking behind the argument that I'm going to make. So the first point I want to stress to you is that the new disabilities of childhood are new. It is possible, believe it or not, to identify the first child patient identified as autistic. That child has a name. That child was identified in the late 1930s by pediatricians and psychologists at Johns Hopkins University, just down the road. You cannot tell me who was the first patient with tuberculosis. You cannot tell me the first patient with cancer. But with the new disabilities of childhood, we know when they emerged, right? Dyslexia did not always exist. There are the first patients identified with dyslexia. The same thing with peanut allergies. We know when the first people had peanut allergies, at least as it was described under our vocabulary. So this is fascinating to me, right? So that we have new disabilities that are literally new. Second, unlike other disabilities, the new disabilities of childhood increase in incidence. Virtually all other disabilities decrease in incidence. We have fewer blind children. We have fewer deaf children. But we have many more children with learning disabilities. So that, again, we'll have to explain all this. All I'm trying to do is simply state what I think are indisputable facts. The third point is that the incidence of the new disabilities of childhood varies starkly across cultures. To take an example that I'm not talking about, post-traumatic stress disorder among soldiers, why is it that the incidence among U.S. soldiers is infinitely higher than it is among Israeli soldiers? It's not that the psychologists are trained differently. It's clearly that the incident varies across cultures, right? It's not simply a question of we have different rubrics, different standards. It's not that, right? It's that the incident, as best we can tell, really does differ. Fourth point, the new disabilities of childhood have no clearly fixed biological definition. That is, they're unlike tuberculosis, right? They are difficult to diagnose, and identification is heavily dependent on subjective observation. Again, I'm not implying these aren't real, right? Just that you need different techniques in order to identify and diagnose the condition, right? Just different, just different. So not only do these disabilities lack a clearly agreed upon definition, but their causes are not well understood. And just as nature abhors a vacuum, when you have a disability with no clearly defined cause, people speculate. And some of those speculations catch on, like the notion that autism in the 1950s was blamed on refrigerator mothers, or more recently that autism was caused by vaccinations, right? These are clearly ridiculous. They've been widely debunked. To a certain extent, they're still held despite that because, I would suggest, we don't have a really firm explanation. And so people just come up with ideas to fill the vacuum. So what is my argument to you? It's that disabilities are a product of the complex interplay among biology, neurology, and cultural and institutional context. And their incidence and expression varies widely across cultures, as do the treatments deemed effective and ethical. Okay? So that's the argument that I'm going to make, that you need a more holistic analysis of these disabilities that goes beyond the strictly psychobiological and neurological, and takes into account cultural context, because historians are obsessed with multi-causal explanations and with the importance of context. Now, in the paper that I've written, I talk about in great detail the development of each of these disabilities, and I guess at some point you'll get to read that paper. But I'm just going to make some brief points here. Let's start with childhood obesity. When I was growing up, not all that long ago, we talked about baby fat. We talked about kids being chubby. In the clothing stores, there was a rack for coats or dresses for kids who were husky. And today, in contrast, we use a very different language, right? We use the language of obesity. Now, it's interesting when we talk about obesity, we tend not to talk about genetics. We tend not to talk about metabolism. We tend not to talk about the changing ethnic makeup of the American population, all of which are relevant, right, to body shape, body size, weight, beauty preferences, right? All those are completely relevant. We tend to talk about diet and exercise. And we particularly tend to focus on sugared soft drinks, right? So Philadelphia, again, just down the road, is going to put into effect a tax on sugared soft drinks because this, we're told, will solve the problem of childhood obesity. And I'm going to tell you, all of those are wrong. Every one of those explanations is wrong. Because the best predictor of obesity is poverty. Now, why is that? There's a lot of different reasons why poverty turns out to be the best predictor. Stress, food deserts, a diet high in high caloric, high fat foods. The fact that mothers are working all the time and don't have a lot of time to prepare well-balanced foods, meals. I mean, there's a lot of different explanations, but it's so interesting to me that when the evidence is clear on a certain point, we ignore that evidence and we choose other explanations. In this case, a highly individualized explanation: you eat too much and you're not doing enough exercise. And that's the problem. So that says as much about us as it does about overweight children. Further, I should simply add, obesity is mainly a problem of adults, not of children. And while there is some correlation between childhood obesity and adult obesity, it is not clear-cut at all. There is some truth to the baby fat hypothesis that was held during my age, and many kids who are plump will be less plump as they grow older. And whether that predicts later weight gain caused by other factors and other decisions, it's not clear at all that there's a linear connection. So to me, it's just fascinating how we as a society choose certain answers and look away from other answers. Second topic, dyslexia. And here is a disability that was first discovered a little more than a century ago when mass schooling began. Because when mass schooling began, it was quickly identified that there were large numbers of kids who found it difficult to learn to read. And the result at that time was to divide kids into two categories. There were normal kids who learned how to read, and there were abnormal kids who did not. And so it's during this period, the late 19th century, that we developed the modern categories of normal and abnormal. Now, later research would identify the root causes of dyslexia in different ways. One early hypothesis was word blindness, so it had something to do with the visual processing. And then there was a widespread belief held for an awfully long time that it was brain injury. That is a physical injury to the brain. And eventually, this would shift to a growing emphasis on brain processing. But what's interesting to me is that there's a widespread understanding among the experts that the word dyslexia is a little bit imprecise, it's nebulous, it conflates a variety of different root causes for reading difficulties that can have very different causation. It can be phonological processing, but it can be other elements. And what it tends to do is to distract attention from another way of treatment. If you compare Sweden to the United States, in Sweden, reading difficulties are treated essentially as a pedagogical problem, not as a neurological or neuroscientific problem. And so the emphasis is on intensive, costly, individualized reading instruction. And it is not at all clear that that method is less effective than what we do in this country. And so it's interesting, again, we see two, quote-unquote, advanced, Western industrialized, post-industrialized societies taking very different approaches to the same social phenomena, coming up with different treatment regimes, and that should at least open our eyes to the fact disabilities can be understood in different ways, treated in different ways. Food allergies. Let's talk about those next. In 1968, peanut allergies came to the nation's attention when a Brown University student ate a bowl of chili and then dropped dead. It was later discovered that peanut butter had been used to thicken the chili. And that brought peanut allergies to national attention, and now often on airplanes or in sports stadiums, you cannot have peanuts. And of course, to a baby boomer, this is all kind of shocking because peanut butter was the basic diet of baby boomers in the 1950s and early 1960s. And furthermore, rates of peanut allergies tend to be very low in East Asia, where peanuts are a big part of the diet. So this raises all kinds of questions, and what's extraordinary is there isn't good research on the answers to these questions. One hypothesis that's been advanced is a hygiene hypothesis. It was originated with polio. In the early 20th century, almost all kids were exposed to polio very early in life, and polio did not cause paralysis. But over time, as households became cleaner, as standards of hygiene rose, people didn't acquire polio till later in life. And it's when they acquired it later that it led to paralysis. And so people wonder, maybe peanut exposure is the same thing. If we don't expose kids to peanuts early, maybe they get allergic to it. Again, I'm a historian, I'm not a doctor. Do not take any medical recommendations from me. Another possibility is that we process peanuts differently. That there's something about the way peanuts are growing, or whatever fertilizers we use, or whatever, that's what's causing this. And there is an argument that food additives and food processing techniques, maybe these are the cause of the increase in food allergies. Again, I don't know the answer. What is extraordinary is the lack of research on the answer to those questions. Because we have a simple solution: don't eat peanuts, or don't eat shellfish, or don't eat something else. But again, I think it's revealing that we chose one solution without doing systematic research in other areas. Now, the last two that I'm going to mention just really briefly are attention deficit disorder and autism. There's a vast literature on both of these. With attention deficit disorder, it really only came into public notice around 1957 when it acquired its name. That was the same moment that the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first space satellite. It led to a fixation in American society on school achievement, which made people much more sensitive to kids who were distracted or inattentive. If you ever read Huckleberry Finn, you'll know that Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn have all the characteristics of attention deficit disorder, right? They're easily distracted, they don't pay attention, they wander around, they hate school, and the like. And Mark Twain doesn't view any of that as a problem. There is a kid with a psychological problem. There's a little German student who is obsessed with work, and he's uncommunicative, and he doesn't play enough, and that's the kid with the disability there, and we would call that kid perfect, right, in our society. Says something, right? Suggests something about changes in definitions. And with autism, we've had a growth in the what I'll call semantic enlargement. That is, instead of seeing autism as a discrete condition, over time we see it as a constellation of traits that are very widely spread in society. So, what conclusions would I draw? The following. Number one, disabilities are not timeless. They may have biological and psychological roots, but they are products of particular contexts, or at least awareness of the problems is a product of particular contexts. Second, in terms of definition, for all the emphasis on neurobiological explanations, I would urge us as a society to look more at context. What is it about our schools that makes a growing number of kids seem not to fit in? And are there changes we could make in our educational system that would make those kids feel more welcome? Could we imagine more personalized educational pathways that will better serve those kids? Maybe the answer is medication, and maybe the answer is changes in pedagogy and curriculum and scheduling. But we're not asking those questions, right, as a society. And while we've moved away from normal versus abnormal as a way of defining disabilities, we tend to label. And I believe that labeling is a form of violence. And I believe that labeling is abusive. Sure, labeling can serve a positive function. After all, how are they going to charge our medical insurance if they don't have a label? But I do believe that labeling inflicts injuries on kids, that it has an impact on their self-esteem and self-image, and that can be very destructive. Next, alarmism. Alarming statistics, sensationalist news reporting, opportunistic politicians, predatory marketers, all of these people play on parental anxieties. And as I said, parental anxieties are greater than ever. So all these people who are really skilled at pushing your buttons know how to do it, right? Whether they're peddling Ritalin or they're peddling something else, they know how to get you to react. And we just have to be more skeptical in general. I am not saying that medical treatments cannot be right for the right kid, but we shouldn't assume that a third of American children are unsuited for school, that suggests that the schools are unsuited for them. Next, we need to be very careful about what I'm going to call conflation. When we talk about food allergies, we often conflate three different phenomena. The first is aversion. Aversion. I hate beets. That does not mean I am allergic to beets, and it doesn't mean that I wouldn't vomit if I ate a beet, because I might, but it's not because I'm allergic to beets, right? I just don't like them for whatever vague psychological reason I have. So that's one possibility, right? Then a second is intolerance. So many Americans are intolerant to lactose, right? The body cannot process it. In general, it turns out that people from Northern Europe during evolutionary times developed tolerance to lactose that most other people in the world didn't. And that's not the same as allergies either, right? And then there are allergies which produce real symptoms and can even result in death. And that's another thing. But we tend to conflate all three of them together. And to make it even more complicated is something that I'm going to mention just briefly, and that is parental influence. How parents react to a trigger very much shapes how the children react to the trigger. Now, easy for me to say, much easier for parents to control their own actions, but it's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. When you have parents involved, it has impact, and we often find it difficult to separate that out. And then we have displacement of adult concerns onto children. It's adults who are concerned about obesity for the most part, not children. It's adults who text and drive, not children. But often in our society, adults project their own anxieties onto kids because we can control kids and we can't control other adults. And we need to be aware of that. No need to make kids' lives worse just because we can't deal with our own problems and dilemmas. So what's my takeaway from all this? My takeaway is simply this. We need a more holistic perspective. We can't assume that all problems are at root simply neurological or biological or psychological, that they could be institutional, they could be situational, they could be contextual. And we need to be very wary of labeling kids because normal human behavior is extremely varied and it's all normal. All that's human is normal to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, we will now take some questions.
Or disputes or disagreements, whatever you wish.
So, let me just tell you, dyslexia is not a reading disability, it's a language disability. And most of the way that we educate children is from the basis of reading, understanding, and language. We can find learning disabilities. I don't need that. We can, because I'll we can find there are markers of children when they start to speak that we can find dyslexia. It has been here over 100 years, and just because the first 100 years when they found it doesn't mean it existed before that.
Right.
Also, Sweden's approach to education is far superior because they use multiple multiple modalities of teaching children, which would encapsulate these children earlier
Right.
and also capture them earlier than we do. It's
Yeah.
a 2-year fail rate for kids in the United States, which is absurd, but that is indeed the case. Just because we don't know that it exists doesn't mean it's not there.
Right.
I'm sure from a historical standpoint,
Yeah.
we can look at this stuff historically, but that doesn't mean that there isn't any markers or things that came in. And women's health is another thing that someone spoke about. Women's health wasn't even looked at. All of the basis of study happened with men for so long. We didn't even know about things that happened with women because you were talking about hysteria and nervous breakdowns and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
My grandma had a nervous breakdown, but as we know now, it had a lot to do with hormones in her body
Right.
that changed. We know so much more from a medical perspective than we do. And I find, well, and we could have another
Yeah.
talk to you. But I will.
Questions over here? Actually, okay, let's take that one and then we'll come to Daphne. It's just, we'll go this way.
I wanted to thank you because I like your approach of this holistic acknowledging that what we see is defined not only by what we know, but also what we think we know. And you have kind of a Foucauldian approach, I think, to trying to trace the epistemic realms throughout history. And I was wondering how you account for being part of today as a scientist. Like you have specific understanding of what real is. You use the word real a couple of times, distinguishing real from imagined, I would say, or created, constructed. How do you make that distinction between, like tuberculosis, you called a real, versus, like, is that distinction not also based on your understanding of today? And will later on it might be that distinction even be different?
In the late 1960s, there was a famous psychologist named Thomas Szasz who wrote a book called The Myth of Mental Illness. And that idea that mental illnesses, the kind of Foucauldian idea that mental illnesses aren't real, that is, they're just a construct that society imposes upon non-conforming individuals, that idea became pretty widespread, and it even made its way into popular culture by writers like Ken Kesey, for example. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest sort of popularized that vision that who's really insane? It's the quote-unquote sane people who are insane. And that's what I am holding out against, because disabilities can affect performance, treatment, self-image, and they're real. But often the symptomology changes over time. That's what I wanted to suggest. And so I'm trying to find a way, a language, that can combine a constructivist argument with a recognition that there is, no doubt, a level of biological, neuropsychological underpinnings. Because it seems to me that for humanists and humanistic social scientists, that's one of our challenges. How are we relevant in a world that's focused on the brain sciences?
Over here, Daphne, over. Thanks.
First of all, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Since we're talking about context, a very popular explanation to some of the disabilities you're mentioning, particularly autism, obesity, ADD, even dyslexia to some degree, has been blamed on media, on brain changes in the brain, especially effect on brain and development with very young children. I wonder if, and to the best of my knowledge, it has not been proven to date. I mean, there's been a little research, not a lot. There's a group in Amsterdam who is researching that for a while, the ADD and autism, and they have not been able to actually provide strong scientific evidence that this indeed is the case. The same with the obesity. The idea that it's just the passivity of staying in front of a screen for so long and lack of sedentary activities, etc., is playing a role in obesity. So to the best of my knowledge, there isn't real evidence, but there is a lot of public discourse that tends to find this as a solution or an explanation. And I'm just wondering if you see that as part of the context of our times that is playing a role in those processes.
I think it's widely accepted at this point that individuals have certain genetic propensities that can be influenced by context, right? That one might have a propensity to addiction that could be encouraged by a particular context or discouraged by that context. And I think that might apply to media influences. For example, the prevalence of cell phones may, I'm just throwing this out, aggravate or intensify certain autistic characteristics, right, that pre-exist. It didn't cause it, but it facilitated it, it enabled it. And I think that that's possible. I don't know. That's not my area. But I would at least suggest that as an area worthy of research for somebody to explore. Because it is often the case that genetic propensities manifest or don't manifest themselves depending on environment. Please.
Thank you. You started to address this question at the end of your talk, but I'm wondering if you could spell out for us more explicitly, perhaps in broad strokes, what you think these new disabilities, their growing incidence, what this tells us about contemporary society. In other words, what can we usefully infer about ourselves or our collective self at this juncture in time from what you observe?
One thing is our obsession with children. Now, do we really like children as a society? I think the answer to that is extremely complicated. But there's no question the United States spends more money on children than any other society. Some of that money is spent on the criminal justice system or child protective services as opposed to treatment of disabilities. But there is an obsession with children. Another thing it tells us is that disabilities law to a certain extent has meant that in a period of austerity that we live in, that one of the few ways you can get additional resources is to identify a disability, right? Because otherwise we won't provide the resources at all. So that there is a tendency, especially in very under-resourced schools, to identify more kids with disabilities because they can get some additional resources, even though they're not adequate. I think it says something about our concern about risk. I think it says a great deal about parents' concern about transmitting their class identity to their children. There is deep fear among many parents that their kids will not be able to replicate their class status, and a fixation on anything that would stand in the way of that has become key to our society. Our general tendency to treat matters in psychological or neuroscientific terms, I mean, I would say all of those are tendencies of our time.
I have been told that your taxi is
Yeah,
going to be
yeah.
arriving soon. So I would like to thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
being here and for your presentation.
thank
We
you.
appreciate it
And if
very
any of
much.
you ever want to talk more about this, you'll probably have my
You'll find
email
him, yes.
address somewhere, and I'd be
Stephen,
happy to.
so
Thank
much,
you.
Stephen.
Thank you so
All
much.
the best.